Welcome to the Therapy Show podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard. In each episode, I interview a seasoned and knowledgeable talk therapist from the counseling world to glean valuable insights, techniques, and tools that you can apply to your practice and your life. And if you're considering a career in the counseling field or just want to hear about what it's like to be a talk therapist, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to today's episode. Before we launch into the show, I want to say hello to all my new friends and colleagues I've met so far at the Low Country Mental Health Conference. As this episode airs, I will be down in Charleston taking part in 2 days of training and learning from some of the best in the field and connecting with the finest talk therapists in the Southeast. And if we haven't connected yet, I'm the one in the tank top that reads The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. So if you see me, come say hi and let me know your feedback on the podcast. I'd be so grateful. Okay, today's episode is really special. I attended a conference this past spring on human and sex trafficking, and as I was sitting in the audience, I realized I had to have Shannon Palm be a guest on the show. Over my many years of attending continuing education conferences and seminars, I had yet to hear this topic be presented, and it got me wondering, how many other talk therapists out there may need to learn about and understand modern day slavery? And if we don't know about it, then we may not be seeing the signs and symptoms of trafficking that may be presenting right before us in our sessions within our clients. So today's episode focuses on human and sex trafficking, and I want to caution you that the material may not be suitable for young people under 11. Now, I'm a mom to an almost 11-year-old and feel she could handle the information if we were listening together and we were processing the content as we listened. However, if you aren't able to be present with your 11-year-old, I'd recommend the listener be at least 14 to 15 to listen on his or her own. Shannon covers 4 main objectives, and she does an incredible job. She also shares her personal experiences working in the field, dealing with compassion fatigue and burnout, plus how we as talk therapists can make a difference in the fight against trafficking. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of The Therapy Show. I am excited to have my guest today. Her name is Shannon Palm, and she works with the South Carolina Attorney General's Office in the VAWA program. Did I get that correct, Shannon?
That's correct.
Okay.
Violence Against Women Act.
Violence Against Women Act. And Shannon and I met, back in the spring at a conference when she presented on the topic that she's going to share with us today. This is a serious topic, and I want to suggest that, most of the stuff in the counseling world is serious for sure. If we have children by chance that are listening in the car or with their parents, just realize we're going to be talking about a lot of topics that might not be age appropriate, probably for, what would you say, Shannon?
I would say probably 11 and up. That's sort of the age range where we have started talking about this in schools, human trafficking. But I might even caution against under 16 if we do get into more of a deeper dive in sex trafficking specifically.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Because when I was sitting in the audience listening to you and Catherine, share this topic, my mom brain was just like going off, and I was, you even know, I was kind of getting flooded with emotions, and I raised my hand and I asked a pretty intense question, and I realized whoa, Lisa, that is your stuff right there. So I just want people to know that if this stirs anything up, we don't intend to do that, but if you need support, you need to talk to somebody afterwards. We're going to share some resources that would be appropriate for our listeners to kind of reach out to, because we do have a variety of listening audience that come and hear the show. So you guys, I'm really excited to have Shannon on. I want to read you her bio. So Shannon Palm currently serves as the VAWA program coordinator for the South Carolina Attorney General's Office. In partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, Ms. Palm trains law enforcement, victim advocates, prosecutors, forensic medical professionals, and judges on domestic violence, sexual assault, violent relationships, stalking, and harassment. She is also responsible for the statewide domestic violence, stalking, and harassment protocol and criminal sexual conduct protocol. She previously worked as coordinator for the State Child Fatality Advisory Committee, Children's Trust Safe Kids South Carolina Coalition Coordinator, long-term trainee for the Maternal and Child Health Bureau's South Carolina Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities Program, and remains an active board member of the Brain Injury Association of South Carolina. Ms. Palm received her Master of Public Health and Master of Social Work degrees from the University of South Carolina, where she received the Michael D. Jarrett Leadership Potential in Public Health Administration Award for her authorship of the Racial Equity Impact Assessment Policy Tool. Prior to entering graduate school, Ms. Palm served children with complex trauma as milieu mental health counselor for Aurora Mental Health Center in Aurora, Colorado, during which time she volunteered as a diagnostic interviewer for the University of Denver's Genes, Environment, and Mood Risk Study of Children and Adolescents. Ms. Palm received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Art Therapy from Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania, focusing her studies on post-traumatic stress. Shannon Palm, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That's so ridiculously long.
No, it's very impressive. It's very impressive. You know, it's funny, as a therapist, my first thought was, as I was reading over your history and what you're passionate about, I thought, oh my gosh, what does she do for like her downtime? How does she like, you know, walk away from her day's work after doing all of this heavy stuff and take care of herself? That was my first
Sure.
thought.
Yeah. Just to answer that question, I do a lot of meditation. I lift weights and enjoy classes, spend time with friends, paint, hike, and just really try and be a good steward of my trauma.
Good. Yes. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that you have those outlets. Okay. So could you share a little bit about how I know your biography is that's a professional, speak. It's got all these titles, it's got all this, your experience, but can you share a little bit maybe about what led you personally kind of finding your way into this work?
Sure. So in high school, going back to high school, I always gravitated toward individuals who seemed to just sort of have be in a place where they wanted to access opportunity. And I would try and identify pathways, not just for them, but for myself. And I really I had a wonderful guidance counselor who led me to art therapy as a career path for me. And I, as I said, I paint. I love creating art. I love looking at art and experiencing other people creating art. And so I really took a dive into that work, and I explored all the different facets, and within it, trauma is a central theme. In addition to that, as my undergraduate degree progressed, I studied abroad in Italy, where I was studying jewelry design, Italian language. I wasn't really doing a lot of the therapeutic modalities or any of that intensive work. It was focused on the art. While I was there, I honestly I ran out of money and I was self-supporting through undergrad, and I ended up getting a job. I got a job as a club promoter for one of the local discos. And in that work, I hadn't previously been exposed. My job was to meet strangers and try and get them to come spend money at the club, buying beverages or trying to get VIP access on the dance floor. And that was my first exposure to human trafficking. And it was something that I didn't recognize at the time, but I knew something wasn't right. And during that time, I did try and go to the local authorities because it seemed like women were being exploited. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really know what to do with that aside from go to the authorities. Unfortunately, that was not a successful route. I ended up moving through that study abroad experience, having been changed, having been exposed to some things that it seemed to me a little off, mm-hmm. and challenged my worldview. But later on through, at post-graduation, I got a job as a milieu mental health counselor. I worked with children with complex trauma, a lot of conduct disorder, a lot of just really complex mental health diagnoses. And I met several children who it seemed to me were being exploited by their caregivers. And at this time, again, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have a name for it. And it seemed that some of these young girls and boys, were engaging in sexual activity at a very young age, 11, 12, 13, 14, and had boyfriends and who were receiving gifts that I knew that did not come from their families and seemed out of place. And so I did research and worked with some of the mental health directors in that space to try and figure out what was going on, and still really didn't get an answer because, again, these were kids with diagnoses like conduct disorder, where they were considered truant, menace to society. The police are, in and out of their homes. They're known to the local law enforcement. And so this is about 2011, 2012. And I am just gathering information about exploitation and mental health and trauma and trying to figure out what to do with it. And I realized, this sort of seems like it could be human trafficking, but I just don't know. And I ended up applying to graduate school and doing the dual degree program with the MSW and the MPH because I wanted to explore this issue and its intersections, right? So while this exploitation was happening, I'm also contending with domestic violence in the home. These children are witness to domestic violence. They're being physically, emotionally, sexually abused themselves. And me as a steward of their trauma and trying to help them be successful in a day treatment program, I'm starting to connect the dots. So I did pursue graduate school and I focused my studies on sexology, basically, and trauma, and really honed in on foreign Soviet Union countries and sex trafficking that was happening and kleptocracy that was coming out of the government that was facilitating this ability to exploit mostly young women, but also young men, girls and boys. And I did a majority of my research on that. I focused on sex trafficking as a public health issue, sexual assault, domestic violence, the insidious incidents of stalking as it relates to all of these public health issues, and just realized there's not a lot of information. I was a part of South Carolina Lobby Day where I did a poster and was brought onto this panel to talk about sex trafficking because in South Carolina, where I did my graduate programs, it was just starting, right? The Human Trafficking Task Force was enacted around the time that I was figuring things out in Colorado as a mental health counselor. And they were starting to make moves to create infrastructure and policy. And so I translated that. I recognized in my research that this is happening abroad, like many people during that time period from about 2010 to 2014, the majority of the focus was on international human trafficking, not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking, indentured servitude, child brides, things of that nature on a global stage. And then sort of realized, actually, it's happening next door. It's happening in South Carolina schools. It's happening all over our country. And trafficking does not require movement. Someone does not have to be kidnapped or taken like the movie. There does not have to be actual perpetrated physical violence. It could be something where there's just a power and control dynamic. And then as we go on, I'm telling this really long story about how I got into this, but it's all connected. I sort of realized that there's a larger issue, and the larger issue is not just abroad, it's right next door.
Wow.
Yeah, I got hired with the Attorney General's office. I was working in child fatality, where I saw heinous crimes perpetrated against children, just severe child abuse and neglect, and a lot of instances where you just couldn't put your finger on it. Something just wasn't right as we were reviewing these child deaths for the state. And I made my transition to the Attorney General's office, focusing on the Violence Against Women Act program, of which human trafficking is a part of. However, our division also has a human trafficking program that's dedicated solely to human trafficking. And that's directed by Catherine Moorhead, who is also the chairperson for the Human Trafficking Task Force in South Carolina.
Okay. I'm listening to your story and I have no words. I really have no words. You have been just the journey that you've had and leading you up to your work is pretty incredible. So thank you for doing what you do and being the person that you are.
Thanks
Wow.
for saying that.
Yeah, no, I have, it's so, I wish I had something really intelligent to say and really awe-inspiring, but I don't. I just want to thank you for doing your work. And I'm just grateful that you're here today. And, I know I shared earlier, I have to be honest with you guys. I went to the training that you and Catherine did kind of not really wanting to go. And I think mainly because I'm a mom and I have 2 little girls, and I knew that it was going to really upset me and sadden me. And but at the same time, I was like, no, Lisa, you have to go. You have to be there. You have to learn. You have to understand what this is so I can teach other therapists. I can talk to young girls. I need to be there outside of my personal life and be a professional. So I had to really give myself a pep talk that day. And I'm so glad that I went. And I'm so glad that I heard you and Catherine and also the is it Kinley come and talk about Kinley. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the attorney that came and spoke. Because you ladies, I tell you what, y'all are doing incredible work and you're helping so many people, not just here in South Carolina, but I imagine that it's like a ripple effect across the country and then across the world. So
sure. I mean, our office is involved in several compendiums, coalitions. The Attorney General is involved in an Attorney General's, for lack of a better word, work group on human trafficking specifically. Our office takes this very, very seriously, and we just want to help people. Yeah. I know it's sort of a glib, cliche kind of thing to say, but it's honest. It's the truth.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about our objectives for our training today. We have about 4 objectives that we want to cover. I'm just going to read them to our listeners so they have an idea of what's to come. So the first objective is listeners will be able to summarize the life and choices victims of trafficking must contend with. Number 2, our listeners will be able to describe the human trafficking cycle in South Carolina, as well as, I'm guessing, perhaps, the U.S., specific to South Carolina, but I imagine we can take this and kind of apply it to other states as well. Listeners will recognize the role of trauma in human trafficking dynamics. Listeners will be able to explain the intersections among human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. So, Shannon, when we think about the ability to summarize, and I know we put the words "the life" in quotations, can you talk about what that is?
Sure. So when you're talking about human trafficking, it really is a subculture. Human trafficking, and I'll sort of attend to, I will have to attend to multiple objectives at once because they are so closely intertwined.
Sure.
So the life refers to all of the different roles, and expectations of these individuals who are being trafficked. And in it, a trafficker seeks out someone who is vulnerable, someone who that trafficker wants something that they can provide. And that something could be money, but it could also be respect. We have a hunger crisis across our nation that the director of the human trafficking program, Catherine Moorhead, goes into detail talking about, because for a kid who is hungry, a cheeseburger is something of value. Mm-hmm. And when you think about gang culture, if you have respect from the trafficker side, that's something of value as well, being exchanged. They're getting respect. Maybe the child who's being trafficked is getting the cheeseburger or the love or the meaningful relationship or famous, right? Mm-hmm. When we think about the internet. And there are things that they must do in sex trafficking and in labor trafficking. Often victims will need to meet a quota. And if they don't meet their quota, something bad happens or something doesn't happen. Children are often used as a token of exploitation, access to their children, safety of their children, pets. We see this, concurrently with domestic violence. Children and pets are a huge control mechanism. And so that quota has to be met by having sex with multiple partners, earning enough money, or doing a certain amount of work. And there are ways that the trafficker monitors that. I referred to earlier the bottom girl or the recruiter. That's typically the person who's going out and finding people. There are the different types of pimps when we're talking about sex trafficking. What we see most often is the Romeo pimp. And the Romeo pimp is someone who boyfriends someone in. They develop a relationship with that person and build that relationship to a place where, and in a place of power and control, where the victim would do anything to gain a better life, to get them out of a situation, to please them, and physical violence isn't typically the go-to mechanism, but to avoid some sort of retribution for not doing something. And that something can be, performing sex acts on another person, or performing sex acts in front of a camera. And we can go on and on and on, talking about all of the different ways that a person can be exploited sexually, but ultimately they think that they will have a life with this person who is their pimp. Mm-hmm. They think that they will provide them with the things that they need to make their life better. And they might start out by purchasing them gifts, showering them with gifts, getting their nails done, paying for their hair appointments, buying them clothes that they couldn't otherwise afford. And while these are tactics, these are also red flags for people on the outside. Mm-hmm. When you see a kid who's coming in wearing Gucci, Versace, has a new Coach bag, has her nails done, that used to come into school in pajamas, or clothes that are secondhand or extremely worn, something is different, right? That becomes a red flag. Mm-hmm. Another way pimps are recruiting, or even their bottom girls are going out and recruiting, another typology of pimp is a CEO pimp. That person provides promises of a job. There's often fame involved, so a modeling career, massage career, or something on television, becoming a YouTube star. There's some sort of promise of success that's mm-hmm. involved. And in order to get it, they are told they just have to jump through these hoops, perform sex acts. Eventually they will make it. Mm-hmm. But going a little more into our communities, there in the life, someone could get sold into the life mm-hmm. By a family member, or a foster care provider, or an intimate partner, where that person isn't their pimp, but they're the person who sold them into that life, where they have to run the track. And if they are an adult, often this looks like prostitution from the outside. But when we think of children, anyone 18 and younger, this is specifically true for South Carolina. Mm-hmm. There is no such thing as a child who is prostituting. They're being commercially sexually exploited. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk about that a little later mm-hmm. when we get into South Carolina specifically. Okay. But this life comes with, as I said, a number of rules that we wouldn't understand, but also an expectation that the victim being trafficked will love and honor and respect their trafficker. And this creates a dynamic where if someone's presenting at a hospital or a shelter or a school, typically it wouldn't be a shelter, but one of the places where they need to seek medical attention, or it would look strange if they didn't show up to school and truancy officers would come after them. They don't self-identify as a victim mm-hmm. because they're getting something of value, whether that be love from the Romeo pimp, or a chance at being a star mm-hmm. or respect, or a family dynamic. They might not even have sexual relations with the pimp, but they could feel a sense of family from all of the women who are being trafficked, men who are being trafficked, and the trafficker and the recruiter. And this is particularly true in vulnerable populations of homelessness, of foster care, where there's an identified trauma and an identified lack of that love, that feeling of fitting in and belonging. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Oh, yeah. That was a great explanation. I'm taking lots of notes over here. So when we talk about the life, we're really referring to, like you said, it's a subculture, and there are rules and expectations around this type of lifestyle. And also, you mentioned when there's trauma involved and with a vulnerable population, that seems to be a lot of where the victims, those are, I don't want to say symptoms, but those are issues that the victims usually have that they're dealing with. Is that right?
Sure. So when trauma is present, just explain that a little further.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay. When trauma is present, individuals are increasingly vulnerable to these types of manipulation and exploitation techniques that are being perpetrated against them. If all is right with their world, they'll probably notice that something's awry here, but also maybe not, because these individuals who are trafficking, who are recruiting, they're pretty good at their job. This is their livelihood. And so they're very charismatic, and they know what to say, and they do their homework. They're by no means uneducated in this type of endeavor. They do their homework, their research, and they really identify what someone's vulnerability is so that they may exploit it.
Right. Okay, great. That's really helpful. Thank you for going over that. Okay, so when we think about the human trafficking cycle, can you tell us what that looks like? And if you definitely want to make it specific to South Carolina, I'm all ears.
Sure. So when I'm talking about a cycle in human trafficking, I'm talking about the same cycle of abuse that survivors of domestic violence, victims of domestic violence experience. It's one where an individual perpetrator presents with something that they want, something that their victim likes and can identify with, whether that is a sense of belonging or future marriage, whatever it is. And then slowly the cycle progresses, and the person starts becoming volatile, whether it's because, oh, we don't have any money, I need you to go turn tricks so that we have money, or you're not doing what I want, and then abuse, immediate abuse occurs, and it sort of explodes that scene. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't have to be physical abuse. That could be economic abuse, intimidation, isolation is pervasive over all of it, sexual abuse, using privilege to get what they want, I think I already said economic abuse, coercion, threats, blackmail. Some sort of behavior happens, and then the person reacts, the victim reacts to it, not really knowing where it came from most of the time. And then the cycle continues, and then there's that loving contrition where it's, I just want us to be successful. I just want you to get what you want. I love you, baby. Here, have some more gifts. Whatever mechanism that they're using for manipulation crops up again, and the cycle continues. And then things are really good, and they start to devolve. Maybe the victim is walking on eggshells. Maybe at this point, they're trying to meet their quota to try and keep this person happy. And then that abuse will occur again. And it's a cycle that goes around and around. Mm-hmm. I talk about things like using privilege. When we think about vulnerability, oftentimes the person is in a position of power or perceived power over the victim, whether or not that's access to an opportunity they want. When I talk about labor trafficking or sex trafficking, that was, with a CEO pimp, where there were promises of a modeling career or a career in film, or that love, that marriage, or in instances of child trafficking, someone is a coach, someone is a teacher, someone is a caregiver or a benefactor. They're posing in this position of power and using that to get what they want. And the threats that come out of that will vary depending on what that relationship is. In South Carolina, the top 5 relationships of victims, the first was employer. The second was an intimate partner. The third was some other relationship. So that could be promise of a career, or like we talked about, a coach, a family member. Mm-hmm. No other relationship But actually, I want to retract that for the other about family member, because familial trafficking is number 5.
Wow.
And so there are all these different relationships specific to South Carolina, but also in a global context that relates and keeps them in this cycle and keeps them under control.
Okay.
So in terms of power and control and maintaining ownership, right? Because when we talk about this, it's about ownership over a product. These victims of trafficking are products for these traffickers. They are what once was kilos of cocaine or a truckload full of guns. It's something that is their product is a human being that is, you can more easily hide it, right? If you're driving down the road with a bunch of people are going to be less suspicious than if you're driving down the road with a car full of guns or a car full of drugs. And so in maintaining their products, much like other products that are purchased and sold, they will assert their control over this person, their ownership with brands, scarification, tattoos. And these are often a person's name, a barcode, the things you've seen possibly in the media. Those things really do exist. They might not be as overt, but this is a part of that subculture. That being said, just going back to the difference in the product from what has been used in criminal enterprises before, this is a product that can be used over and over and over and over versus drugs or guns. Once it's sold, and you need to acquire more. Once someone is recruited into the life of human trafficking, sex trafficking, or under the control of someone in a labor trafficking environment where they have their passport or they have their child and they won't let them go until they perform this work, they have that product. That product isn't going anywhere. And that product may even not know that they're a product. Yeah, I know it's so crass to keep saying product and talking about human beings this way, but this is how traffickers are looking at the situation. They're getting smarter. They are looking at ways that they can engage in criminal activity and not get caught as easily.
Right.
That's what I had to say about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you explained that. And I think that's really helpful. I keep going back to like, this is just so foreign to me, because of the world that I live in and how I was raised. And I go back to the idea of my wants and my needs were validated when I was a child. And so I didn't even know this was going on because I was a happy child, loving parents, no trauma, it's just very foreign to me, to know that this is going on, but yet at the same time, like, it's happening. It's happening. And I think that's why when I was sitting in that audience listening to this, and as I am here right now, I'm writing down notes and I'm jotting down information, and I just like, how do we get this out to more and more people? How do we help these people, get out of these bad situations? And I know you're going to talk a little bit about the resources that are out there and the counseling that's available. And I know that's coming.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when you think about in South Carolina specifically, just to answer your question, how do we get this out there? I will talk about resources. However, there is a South Carolina mandate that certain public places, such as hotels, gas stations, have these posters with the hotline on it. So this is sort of a tricky situation as a counselor, as a therapist, or as just a community member. If you see something, say something. That's what we talk about in bystander intervention, right? However, this is insidious, dangerous,
right?
Not something you should just jump into lightly. Right. And so there is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I'll say the hotline number when we talk about resources. And there's the poster project. There are the different task forces that community members are encouraged to be a part of. That's really how we get the awareness out there and help these people, because law enforcement, they do their jobs. They're being trained continuously. And so we don't need people running in and trying to save these victims, stalking out hotels, trying to find the people who park backwards. You can't see their license plate. We don't need you to do that. And that's actually extremely dangerous for both the victim and the individual who's trying to do that and try and be that savior. So I just wanted to make that really clear that this is a problem and we want to do something about it, but there are safe and strategic ways that we are helping individuals who are caught up in this lifestyle, and it's not a lifestyle, a crime, really, that are not putting your life at risk and putting theirs at risk. Because as we may all know, and hopefully, but maybe not, the most dangerous time in a victim of violent relationship, intimate partner violence, or violent relationship is when they're trying to leave. And so if someone is going in and trying to rescue them, and we don't have law enforcement on standby, shelter advocates, counselors, we don't have this team of people who need to be involved there, you're putting that person's life at risk.
Right. And I'm glad you said that. It's so important to know that there's a whole policy, like there's policies and procedures for this. And I love how you shared, say something. So if we suspect something, who do we say something to? As a therapist, as a community member, as a mom, as a granddad, like what do we do?
Right. So as a therapist, you're mandated reporters, right?
Yep.
And so you would make a report to law enforcement if you fear that their life is in danger or they're going to harm someone else, right? So law enforcement, 100%. That same thing goes for granddad, for family member, for church member, for friend. Call law enforcement. And if you call law enforcement and you're still worried, you can also call the hotline. And I'll just say the number. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. And they will, again, send out that information to law enforcement. So I really do have to say law enforcement is your best bet. Call 911 if you think an emergency is happening. But if you want more information, you can call the hotline at any time. If you want to help someone get resources, you can call the national hotline. That's why it's there.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I know you've talked a little bit about trauma and human trafficking dynamics. Could you talk some more about that?
Sure. So when you think about trauma, I'll start where we just ended.
Okay.
When you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a pyramid of needs that need to be met for someone to get to where they can interact in the world and feel like a productive member of society, self-actualization, right? You start off with psychological safety, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. When someone's basic needs are not being met, they can't access those other levels. And so when someone is experiencing homelessness, has no food in the house, experiencing hunger, is exposed to violence in the home, a parent who's incarcerated, traumatic events in childhood. And what I'm really talking about here is the adverse childhood experiences. That term came out of a study done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente, and I'll get into that. When those needs aren't being met, they're already at an increased risk of being exploited. They're vulnerable. In addition to that, sexual orientation identification, gender orientation identification, race, religion, ability, and disability, those are all factors that increase vulnerability of an individual. And so that all combined with just real life trauma creates the perfect storm for someone to come in and say, hey, I can fill this gap. Okay. I'm going to get into adverse childhood experiences just a bit. So that study took place and asked adults to look back at their childhood and adolescence. And when they looked back at their childhood and adolescence, there's a screening tool. And that screening tool identifies, did you have a parent who was incarcerated? Did one or more of your parents experience chemical dependency or drug abuse? Those questions are asked and then tallied up to come up with an ACE score, or an adverse childhood experiences score. With just one ACE, a person is at increased risk for early death, ultimately. It can actually take years off your life if you have this experience. That being said, there are protective factors, and those protective factors come in the form of a trusted adult, nurturing relationships that can protect a person from these experiences impacting their life course development. Okay. Mm-hmm. So as that child, and I'll just do a little bit on the brain science of it all, which I'm sure people have gotten before, but it's always nice to look back at it. A child, an infant, is born with just an infinite number of synapses. Mm-hmm. And as they experience life and have interactions with individuals, have interactions with parents, adults, other children, they learn different neural connections are myelinated. And when they're myelinated, that's a neural pathway that is sort of solidified in their brain, right? Mm-hmm. And so when these experiences are positive, that's the neural pathway that they have and they're retaining, a positive experience neural pathway. I like chocolate milk. Mom gives me chocolate milk. Mm-hmm. And when their experiences are negative, persisting, that's when we have those pathways. Mom hits dad. Mom yells at dad. Just, whatever it is. In adult relationships, this is the neural pathway that's being myelinated. This is what's being solidified. And then in adolescence, through a process called pruning, the unused synapses, the unused neural pathways, or the ones that didn't become neural pathways, they didn't connect, they go away, and you're left with what was myelinated. And that's what you're starting out with, mm-hmm. and how you're approaching the world. Mm-hmm. And so there are different types of stress, and everyone goes through stress. It's not expected that anyone will live a life where they have never experienced any stress. But the different types of stress can be categorized, right? So you have stress that is pretty mild. It's tolerable, which is tackling a tough math problem or, something that is surmountable. You'll come through and you'll probably be better for it. You'll be smarter for it. You'll have learned something. And then there is more insidious stress, right? It's maybe not insidious, maybe that's the wrong word, but more moderate stress where it's death of the loved one or something that will cause a person to really have to work to move past this stress. Mm-hmm. And then the last type of stress is toxic stress. And that's that persistent, ongoing stress that may be insurmountable if you don't have protective factors in place, strong community, trusted adults, mm-hmm. things of that nature. And that toxic stress is what creates vulnerabilities that impact someone's cognition, their ability to interact socially, their mental health, their participation in risk factors later on in life. And then, as I said, early death, disease, exposure to things, or increased risk of things such as diabetes, lung cancer, things like that, that may or may not be a result of the risk activities that they're participating in, but also have been correlated with just the adverse childhood experience itself. Mm-hmm. And so as we look at that, a person who has all of these negative synapses, all of these negative neural pathways, and they don't have trusted adults, they don't have a strong community, they don't have a relationship or feel connected to their school, they're not scoring well on their cognitive tests in school, and they don't feel like they fit in, right? These are the kids who may be diagnosed with ADHD, cognitive disorder, some sort of mental health diagnosis. They get a label slapped on them. They're bursting out in class, destroying classrooms, something like that. Maybe these are the kids that might be in a day treatment program. Mm-hmm. But if they receive no intervention, or even just in that moment, they're extremely vulnerable to exploitation because they are missing those protective factors and are most likely seeking, because that's what we do as human beings. We seek outside of ourselves for the things that are lacking in our environment. Mm-hmm. And that's when human trafficking, teen dating violence, stalking and harassment, domestic violence, that's when these things come into play, right? Because people who are presenting and may or may not actually have the things that these children, these adolescents, these adults need and want in their life, as these protective mechanisms that they are just inherently seeking, they're presenting with it. And then they're easily able to manipulate the situation to get their trust, their love, their respect, or that then these incidents can happen. And then you're in the cycle of abuse.
Right. Okay. That is an amazing explanation and description. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, no, that was awesome. I'm learning, I'm learning, and I love learning. I love, being reminded of Maslow's hierarchy of need, support systems. I have no words because this is not my usual topic that I work within. So, and I am fascinated by all this information, and it makes so much sense. And, over the years of being a therapist, a lot of what you're talking about it's like we take all this information and we're constantly assessing, we're constantly trying to figure out like what's going on, what is the truth for this person, not judging it by any means, but trying to figure out what is the truth for this person and what are they, when somebody presents with symptoms, sometimes I think they're trying to get their needs met, and this is the only way they know how. Mm-hmm. And so over the years, I've met some people who do some pretty amazing things to get their needs met. And it just sets off that gut reaction, that intuition of there's something going on here. And so talk therapists that are listening, I want to reiterate, like, trust your gut, trust your experience, trust everything when you are sitting with somebody. And like Shannon has said so many times, her gut, something was not right when she was talking to somebody or was having an experience. Like, she knew something was off. And I think that's that gut instinct, that clinical, insight that we have that most people are just going to blow off, or they're not going to think twice about it. So I have no words.
Just as an aside, and this is not coming from my office, this is just coming from me, is my experience is that we are trained as people to second guess our gut feelings, right? Mm-hmm. And in training, so I've gone through training for social work, I've gone through training for art therapy, but I have to guess that licensed professional counselors and other clinical workers have the same feelings, where you earn your diploma by saying the things you need to say, right? Mm-hmm. But that clinical, like what you said, that clinical instinct, mm-hmm. that gut feeling is where you see results. That's mm-hmm. where you identify the issues and where you can work with individuals and groups to ensure their safety. I mean, ultimately it's about safety, right?
Right.
And on the other side of things, clinical workers, people who work in the clinical field, are meant to be a reflection, mm-hmm. and meant to reflect what's going on. Mm-hmm. And if an individual that you're working with, or a group that you're working with, if these people have been conditioned, not just by society, but an individual who is very skilled at what they're doing to try and manipulate a situation and get the result that they want, they don't trust their gut. They can't identify that feeling. So empowering those individuals to be able to do so, mm-hmm. and describing what you feel, I have found just in my personal experience that it is the most effective way to help someone to be a steward of their own trauma, mm-hmm. is just recognizing, oh, I have no sense of this gut feeling. Mm-hmm. It's off. So that's just an aside.
Yeah. And I think that's a great aside. Can you think of a time in your recent history where you've used that, kind of sharing your feelings with the victim, or I know that's a label that but in terms of like, we're referring to somebody who is in the life as, the victim.
Sure. And so to address that, mm-hmm. I use victim because I work in the criminal justice system, and right. victim is across the board a way for every single professional I work with to identify what I'm talking about.
Sure.
We can use survivor.
Sure.
That's more empowering.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I mean, not the best example. I won't use the last example. But the best example I can think of where that was happening, I was meeting for individual counseling with a young lady. The one I mentioned, or I didn't mention specifically, but I mentioned before, came into class with different clothes, which with very high-end, expensive things, with her hair done, with her new purse. Mm-hmm. And we weren't doing individual counseling. We were doing some art making modalities. Mm-hmm. And shifted to that because I noticed that change. And I asked her to tell me, what her experience is with her boyfriend, with her older boyfriend, what that looks like, what about it makes her feel special, instead of just identifying, this doesn't look right. Right. I sort of gave her the opportunity to tell me what does feel right for her. Mm-hmm. And then once she told me, I, reflected back, wow, that must make you feel really special. Mm-hmm. And got into it. The details are really fuzzy about what I specifically said. Mm-hmm. But I just said to her, I sort of thought about it for a moment, and I said, you know what? I have this gut feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it sort of makes my heart beat a little faster when you talk about this person, but it's not, I really want it to be with me being happy for you. And I'm happy that you're feeling happy. Mm-hmm. But this person just doesn't feel right to me. Can you tell me a little bit more about him? And she sort of got a wide-eyed look about her. Right. And then I said, actually, have you ever gotten that feeling? Do you know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. And then we were able to have the conversation. Mm-hmm. Yes, when she first met him, mm-hmm. she got that feeling, but he started buying her stuff mm-hmm. and making her feel good. And now she feels more like an adult. And just, it progressed on. I was just sort of going off of my gut feelings mm-hmm. and seeing if she could identify with that fear. Because we have that. We're in tune with that innately. And then it sort of gets washed and diluted where we don't really trust that in my personal experience. Does that answer your question appropriately?
Oh, yes, it definitely does. And I think that's a really great example of, like you said, using our feelings as reflections, but yet at the same time, not jumping onto that person and, where did you get your hair done and what's going on? This is not okay.
Right. You better believe I wanted to
right.
take her home with me and say, you will never see this person again.
Right. But
something's not right. I'm afraid. But that's not helpful or therapeutic.
No, yeah, but you're right. And I'm laughing because I think, I would have to really work on that part of my therapy if I was working with this population. I would have to really, I'd have to work on, holding myself back and I'd have to be aware of my own stuff, first of all. But I like how you were able to really go into, that experiential side of yourself and use that, like tap into that and help her understand or bring her back to her own experience. Cause I think that's where the therapeutic work is. That's where the insight and awareness that we have to help our clients have for themselves. Because if they don't have it, from my years of working in this, the only way they get it is through having that experience. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just so smart. And just very wise and very seasoned. And so thank you for sharing how that works or how you approach it.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is awesome. This is just I just want you to know it's so good.
I'm so glad.
Yeah. I don't know what the word, I don't want to use the word naive. I'm just not my world. And I want people to really, most people listening, I mean, I'm guessing it's not their world either. And so I don't want to sound so dumbfounded, like, oh.
Right. Can we honor that though? Like, thankfully, this is not everyone's world, right?
Right. True. And I think that's why I'm so impressed by the fact that you do this work. It can't be easy, and I can only imagine what you guys have seen and heard and witnessed in your office. And so you guys are doing incredible work, and I'm grateful that you're doing it. So grateful.
Well, thank you. But I'm just noticing the fact that I no longer do direct work. And there's a reason for that, right?
Right.
I 100% respect everyone who's out there on the front lines and really in the thick of this, mm-hmm. right? Whether they know it's human trafficking or domestic violence or any of these violent crimes or not, they're there and they're bearing witness to these people's stories.
Yeah. Those are the those are the folks that are really doing the hard work and taking, being there with the survivors or victims and meeting them where they're at and helping them with their trauma and helping them decide how they want to move forward in their lives. And it can't be easy. It can't be easy for anybody. So I'm glad you shared that, because that's important to know that there's probably a point in this work where you have to kind of take a step back and do something different, like kind of pivot a little bit, maybe stay within the field. So can you share a little bit about how that was for you? You were doing the frontline services and then you decided to kind of do more behind the scenes.
Sure.
Where you are.
Sure. I, in this work, always wanted to be in direct service and really relished the idea of bearing witness and walking shoulder to shoulder with people in their trauma and walking through their trauma, and just sitting with people in the in the discomfort. Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be that tough warrior. And I got into it and I started, piecing apart these threads and finding individual threads within the thread, right? It's not just the thread. There's all of these fibers, and ended up with, this is sort of an abstract way to talk about it, but I ended up with this fibrous mess because I had so many questions and there weren't any answers. And that in and of itself is enough to cause someone burnout, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I was also in a space and in an environment where people were doing restraints. I was physically attacked multiple times because trauma expresses itself physically a lot. And I felt in myself on a day when I went to work and a child was tearing apart a classroom, throwing things at me. And I was sitting there reading a book.
Right.
As this child is doing this. And I mean, oftentimes ignoring a behavior until we can come back might be a therapeutic modality. In this situation, it was, I was turned off. I was turned off from what was happening around me. This particular child obviously wanted my attention. Mm-hmm. And I definitely could have approached it in a therapeutic way, but I was over it, just to be frank. And that made me realize, one, that I don't think I'm supported the way I need to be, not just in myself. I need to have my own support network and my own items of self-care that I'm, feeding myself and feeding my trauma from, my secondary trauma that I'm receiving every day. But in the environment, everyone was burnt out.
Right.
And we would have meetings, and the meetings were not so much smack talking, but just vomiting awful things that had happened throughout the day and re-traumatizing everyone and diving deep into that to play the blame game.
Sure.
It was just a toxic environment, right? And it wasn't the fault of the agency or the individuals. It was from the work.
Right.
The diagnoses had become so severe. We weren't identifying things like human trafficking and domestic violence in the home and attending to those root causes of the behavior in the classroom. And so it was then that I realized I need to figure something else out. I need to figure out a different angle and a way that I can help kids and I can do this work and I can use what I've learned, but that I can maybe come back to this direct place. That I'm sort of removed and I'm able to help other people not get to this place that I'm at right now.
Right.
And so that's where I started looking at different graduate programs about how I can change it up and work from maybe a policy side. I had been very active in advocacy outside of what I was doing at work, something that brought me joy. And I sort of found my little corner where I could make a difference and work on myself and work on this work. And working on myself was probably the biggest challenge, right? But also, right. So that I could be a pillar of support for people who maybe are, able to stay in this work for longer or had a different experience. And then I also have, my education to fall back on. If I want to go back in direct service, I would probably get some more training to make sure I was up on what I needed to know and licensure was there, and then I could go back to it. But it was in the throes of severe burnout that I recognized, hey, this is not working and I am not being helpful to myself or anyone else. One of those cliche sayings is you can't pour from an empty cup. I was in a desert looking for water, right? So
yeah. Thank you for sharing your story on that. I'm over here nodding my head and, saying, yes, girl, I get it. You're not alone we can compare trauma to trauma and say, well, yours was more severe, who you worked with, your population, or we can go
battle stories.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, we could easily get into that. And it, I think about the years I've been doing clinical work and I've hit burnout, and I'll be honest with you. Like I have been in that space, in my work of, oh, here we go with another story about the, PTSD from the military. Like, oh yeah, you were deployed. And that's when I know that I am in burnout. And that's when, and I'm just kind of, I want you to know, I want our listeners to know that it's common, and it's something that we don't really share enough about, I think, or talk about, or maybe within my circle, we don't talk enough about it because we don't want that to happen to us. We want to care. We want to support. We want to keep doing our work, but we do get to a point and you described it to a T, our own personal self-care, our environment, but the other people that we work with, it's all kind of like we have to work to avoid burnout. And sometimes our energy just is just sucking so low and so hard that it's hard to like pull yourself out of it, and you just have to do something different. And
sure. And I just want to make it clear that I by no means think that everyone just has to, start over to escape it, right? I had been in and out of burnout, pulled myself through it, got back to a better place, and then just gotten dragged back down due to various circumstances. And certainly there could have been a way that I came out of that and still worked in direct service. This is just the route that I took.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm so glad you did, because you have a passion and you have major skills when it comes to presenting and training and explaining it in a very,
I love it.
Yeah. And when I watched your training at the seminar, I mean, it was very interactive. It was very, I don't want to use the word fun, but we, as a group, all of us therapists together, kind of talking amongst ourselves, we were really kind of figuring things out as a team. And then we were talking with each other about, well, why do you think she would ask this question? So it was very, very cool. And, I'll be honest, me sitting in the back going, oh, I don't want to get up and do something experiential. I just want to sit here and drink my coffee and eat my cookie and just sit here. But I'm so glad that you were there that day and you had us go through that, because I learned so much. And I knew after that, I was like, I've got to have Shannon come on the therapy show and talk about all of this.
I'm so glad, and I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, the one thing that I have as the last objective is listeners will be able to explain the intersection among human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. But if you were to ask me to explain the intersection, I would say it all kind of goes back to some type of vulnerability and trauma. Is that kind of the intersection or is there more to it than that?
So that's at its core, that's what it is. It's power and control, trauma and resilience. But in the current climate of where we are at as a state, but also as a nation, I just want to identify that a lot of these survivors, these victim survivors of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, but to include, of course, labor trafficking, are presenting at hospitals as victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Because as I crassly mentioned earlier, this is a product, and the trafficker, if something's broken, it's too much trouble to get a new one. They're going to try and get a quick fix.
Right.
So they go to hospitals to get medication. They go to get care, anything that will get them back on the track, able to meet their quotas faster and more effectively. They will seek that medical attention. Some things to notice and to ask questions about. If someone's storyline does not make sense, or they don't really know where they are, they don't know how they got to where they are. There's someone there and they tell someone it's an uncle and then they're a cousin, right? These are all red flags. But also if someone has an open line of communication, that's something we've seen a lot, where they'll have a cell phone that's on speakerphone throughout the whole visit, whether it is at school, at a hospital, critical care venue of some sort. These are the types of things to look out for, just to identify. And like I said, it might present as a sexual assault. Someone sexually assaulted me. I don't want to do forensic kit. Okay. Or you can tell they don't even say anything. They have severe damage to their vaginal or anal areas or their mouth, or, where you say, oh, this looks like sexual assault. As a clinician, as a nurse, and just to delve a little deeper, it might present in one way and be both. It could be sexual assault and domestic violence. People who are engaged in commercial sex, they can be sexually assaulted as well. Someone who is, it gets tricky, right? Someone who you might write off, oh, this person is willfully engaging in prostitution, right? Dive a little deeper. We all have those moments where we're like, oh, not this again, this revolving door. These intersections are pervasive and make us think things that keep that person in the life. So that's just my little plug for identifying the intersections.
Okay. Well, that's really helpful. I think that I wouldn't have thought about that, going that route. So thank you for explaining that. That's really helpful. Okay. Well, this was incredible. I don't know. I'm just like, I don't even know what to say. I feel so like inadequate right now, because the work that you do is just incredible. And so I know I keep saying that, but I'm just blown away. And well, thank you so much, Shannon, for being here today. I have learned so much, and you have shared some amazing knowledge and wisdom and clinical insight with our listeners. Is there anything that you would like to share before we wrap up? Maybe if you can, is there any resources that you'd like to recommend, a website, if people want to learn more about the program in South Carolina, or just overall, throughout the nation?
Absolutely. So anyone interested in learning more about human trafficking in South Carolina is invited to join the Attorney General's office at the task force meetings, which are posted to the public, open to the public. You can find information about that and other ways to get involved, as well as resources, the annual report that has statistics available to you. That website for the Human Trafficking Task Force in South Carolina is humantrafficking.scag.gov. Okay. So humantrafficking.scag, South Carolina Attorney General.gov. In addition to that, I'll just say the National Human Trafficking Hotline number one more time. That is 1-888-737-7888.
Awesome. Thank you. And what about clinical resources? Do you know of any things off the top of your head that you could share?
So we have a paucity of resources here in South Carolina. We are trying to build infrastructure. We're rated this past year as the most improved state in the nation, which is sort of exciting news, but also a little concerning, considering we are in great need of shelters, in great need of wraparound services, clinical services across our state. We do have some resources. We have Jasmine Road and Switch up in Greenville. We have Lighthouse for Life. There are a number, and everyone who has been vetted by the task force is going to be on that website, and you can access that but resources for screening tools and clinical support, CEUs, things of that nature are forthcoming. There are some screening tool resources on the Human Trafficking Task Force website, but again, there has not been one that has emerged as of yet. That being said, there are 2 direct services subcommittees. The one I'm on is the Adult Services Subcommittee. There's also a Child Services Subcommittee because I'm funded by the VAWA grant. I do not deal with anything 11 and under per federal regulations, but there is that group, and they are trying to identify standards. We actually submitted standards for review to the Survivor Advisory Committee recently for across the state, and that those run the gamut: clinical standards, standards for shelters, housing, you name it. We're trying to formalize it. So I would encourage people to really thoroughly look through the website, and feel free to reach out to Catherine Moorhead at the Attorney General's office. Her email can be direct access from that website. If they have any questions or want to become more involved, I think that would just be very welcome.
Okay, awesome. That's great. Great resources and great information to point people to. So once again, thank you so much, Shannon, for being on the show today. I've learned so much. I'm going to put everything that we talked about, all the websites and phone numbers and all that into the show notes.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah. So thanks again.
Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. I know there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and I'm thankful you've chosen to listen to mine. Be sure to visit lisamustard.com to access the show notes and discover more fantastic content. And I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the show. Thank you.